I took those spark plug leads off of there, off the spark plugs. I got all 4 of them off of there. Well, now the engine is safe to work on. Should have done that before I took that cowling off, but now it's safe to work on. I can turn that propeller around and stuff, and there's no chance of it firing. The battery is underneath the front seat. I need to take the battery cables off too. That's not near as important. The battery has nothing to do with the ignition system on the airplane. It's just the charging system and stuff, but there's still wires in there that could possibly short out or ground out and cause a problem if I didn't do that. So anyway, I'll disconnect. I have to get in there and disconnect that. Doggone cat is having a ball there working on those plugs, the balls on those floats. As bad as the seagulls, they come down there, or the crows, they come down there on the floats on the when it's down on the dock, and they'll pick on those strings and pull the float balls out. The balls are go in there and plug the pump outs up so they don't get rainwater in them. Seagulls will grab those strings on that and worry those until they get those balls out of there. Well, anyway, it's entertaining the cat, so that's not, and they're not going to get any rain in them now anyway. So I've had this little heater inside the cockpit here all winter, keeping it dry in there. It's just a 500-watt heater. I think it was like $10 or $12 for 3 of them. I don't know whether I got it off of eBay or Amazon, but it worked pretty good for that. Kept it nice and dry in here. Didn't keep it warm during that real cold spell, but it's kept it nice and dry in there anyway. Where you want to get in there now? Well, this is the front seat in the airplane. You got a hatch there that goes down over the battery. You got a bracket underneath the front seat for the little battery, so get short cables and everything going in there. Don't have much amperage loss. Little lightweight battery. Well, I got to get a 10mm wrench and disconnect the ground lead on the battery, so I took everything out of here and took it over to the shop to hang it up and put it away a few days ago. Now I got to go dig everything out again. Hey, what are you doing in there? Cat's got to explore every nook and cranny there is. I kept everything closed up pretty good all winter so they wouldn't go in there and nest in there, but she's in there now checking it out. Maybe get her a rag or something to get her in the back and clean the back of that baggage compartment out. All I needed to do was just disconnect that battery, but I went ahead and took it out of the airplane, brought it over here and set it on the bench, and I hooked the battery charger up to it. It's a good battery and it probably doesn't need to be charged, but this is a special charger made for those AGM batteries. This is what they recommend for it. I usually like to take that battery out of the airplane when I put it away in the winter and charge it up and then put it on the bench here to store it, but I left it in there all winter this winter. It doesn't really hurt it any, but a good idea to go ahead and bring it out here and charge it up, and then we can inspect the battery and everything. Well, I got the spark plugs disconnected and the battery disconnected, so the airplane's safe to work on now. Not sure exactly what I'm going to do start with first here. I don't know. I'll have to think about it. I was going to say maybe I'll drop the exhaust down off of it first. I got to take the baffling off, and I guess I could take the alternator and the starter off, then they're out of the way, and that makes it easier to get in there. But it's kind of the same thing. If I drop the exhaust down on it, then it makes it easier to get in there too underneath it, to work on taking that baffling and other stuff off. Oh, and it looks like I got to take the carburetor off to get it in that shipping crate that they sent. So that engine come with the carburetor in a box beside it. So anyway, I guess you might as well get started at disassembling that thing. I got the exhaust system off. I'm looking at it. It's cursory. I don't see anything wrong with it. There was a loose nut on the number 2 cylinder, so that flange wasn't on there tight. And we got some leak out of the slip joint where the couples together, where the number 3 and number 4 stacks for those two coupled together. It was leaking out of that, and leaking where it goes into the muffler. They look like they were put together dry, but they look pretty good. I don't really see anything wrong with them. I've got another set of stacks that I had overhauled. I've got them up overhead someplace. I could dig those out and swap them out and send these in and have them refurbished, but I really don't see anything wrong with them. But we'll see what the mechanics have to say when they get here. So I guess the next thing I can do is start taking that baffling and stuff off of there. I did find one air hose, the one that came from the rear of that right-hand baffling down to the muffler. That one had a hole wore in it from where it was rubbing on the spark plug leads. Everything else looked pretty good. Anyway, that's a good news. That baffling is okay. I can get that muffler out of there. To get that out of there, I've got to swing that engine mount over, so we'll just leave that sitting there for now. I got the baffling off the right side. A little bit of finagling to get it off. Mostly just screws. It screws into the cylinder heads, and then there's another bolt that goes in to the crankcase up the front there just above the alternator. Some other stuff on the back. The hardest part of it is there's a little tie rod that goes across the bottom of the cylinders to hold the front piece and the back piece vertical. And that one's always kind of a pain in the butt to get out. I got it out of there pretty good, no big deal. Anyway, the right side's off. Left side's a little bit different situation because you've got the oil cooler back there. The oil cooler is mounted to the rear baffle on the baffling there, so that one's going to be a little tougher. But I've got part of the baffling off here on the left-hand side. I've got the front part here to where it goes in front of this number 2 cylinder. I got that off, and again that one a little tougher because it's got that tie rod underneath there that holds that flat and holds the rear one flat. And then this side piece off. This rear piece of the baffling going to be a little bit more trouble because it's got the oil cooler mounted up here, and it's busy over here on this side. So you got the oil cooler here, got the vent tube here for the crankcase vent. I'm going to pull it out of the way. Got the oil filter over here on this side. I can take it off there and get it out of the way. And then it's a matter of getting this oil cooler off of there. And I think I don't know what I'm going to do here with that. I can take that off. Once I get that oil filter off there, I can take that hose there off of that port where it comes out of the crankcase. And then the other one, the return line, is down underneath there. I guess I could take that off too and maybe pull that whole thing out of there. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I've had to doctor this up a whole bunch of times because that oil cooler there vibrates and it puts a lot of stress and strain on this thing. We'll see how it holds together when I get it off of there. I got that rear baffle off of there. That wasn't too bad. Said I took that breather tube off and the oil filter off, and then I unhooked those oil cooler hoses off from the engine here, both this side and down underneath where they go on. I had a couple brackets that I'd built to put in there to stiffen that thing up and to hold it on there better. And that one nut was a little bit tough, or bolt was a little bit tough to get out of there, but it came okay. Anyway, that's all off of there. So those were kind of the most complicated things that's had to come off. Now I've got to unhook the wiring harness here that goes out to the starter. This is it here, and that goes underneath there and out there, and then the alternator's the same way. And I take the starter off and the alternator off, and I disconnect this cable that controls the carburetor heat and the cable that controls the carburetor mixture, the fuel line, that one's getting kind of stiff, and the throttle cable, and of course the primer lines. I got to disconnect the primer lines, and that's it. Then the engine can come off there. Oh, there's a ground here, but that's got to come off. That's just one bolt there, and then this bracket is for the baffling here. That's got to come off, and of course the propeller and the prop spinner, that's got to come off. Well, this thing's lightening up pretty good. I got the starter off and the alternator off. Starter mount pad is right here. It's got 3 studs that stick down and then 1 bolt goes up in there. Well, that just takes a 1/2 inch wrench for everything on that. It's got the 4 here that hold it on, and then the lug that holds the cable on. Over on this side is where the alternator mounts. There's mount pads back here, but I didn't use those on this alternator. It's a small alternator from B&C, and so it just has a bracket that mounts right here on this little pad. And then of course it's got an arm on it, just like every alternator, that mounts here on the front of the nose of the crankcase. Arm that comes down, and the alternator mounts right here. So that was pretty straightforward. That took 1/2 inch wrenches on that, except for 2. The alternator is a foreign alternator, or a modern small alternator, and the 1 bolt that holds the alternator onto the arm for the adjustment was odd size. It was a number 13, took a number 13 wrench, and then the lug that the battery wire, alternator wire, hooks onto it took a number 10. That's kind of a odd thing on this engine, because everything on here is SAE. Almost all of it takes either a 3/8 inch wrench or 7/16 inch wrench. There's a few things that take 1/2 inch, like the studs here, the bolts for the exhaust where they go on, they take 1/2 inch. I think the next thing we'll take off there is the carburetor, and that takes 1/2 inch. The real oddball on the carburetor is the fuel line, and that one takes an 11/16. So the sump bolts onto the crankcase here with some little studs, and I put Adel clamps on here and put underneath those studs. So that's disconnected. So the next thing I'm going to do is disconnect the carburetor. And the carburetor, first thing is take this fuel hose off of here. Then we have a cable for the carburetor heat control, cable for the mixture control, and a cable over here for the throttle control, and that's it. And then it's a matter of taking these bolts off the studs here at the bottom of the sump, and the carburetor can come off. Well, here's the carburetor, got it off. Now there's air boxes still bolted onto it, but that air box is safety wired. The bolts that attach the air box onto the carburetor are safety wired, so it's just easier to do that off the airplane. The carburetor is basically pretty simple. There's 4 studs that stick down out of the oil sump, and nuts go on those. Except this one back here, the way this casting is, you got to loosen that nut up a little bit, and you got to loosen all the rest of them up and let the carburetor drop down before you can get that nut off of the stud. So, anyway, carburetor's off there. I have to take the air box off because that is part of the airframe, and that'll just get put on the new carburetor. Well, that just about does it as far as stripping the engine down and getting all the parts off of it. I still have to take the line off for the oil pressure gauge. I think I got everything else all off there. All I have to, I've got the EGT probe wire is tied into the wiring harness for the spark plugs. It's got some tie wraps on there and stuff. I have to disconnect that. That goes through the firewall, and that stays with the airframe, but the wiring harness, spark plug leads go with the engine. So I'll get that hose off of there for the oil pressure, that lead for the EGT loose, and then the engine will be ready to come off there except for the propeller. Oh, the primer lines. I can disconnect the single primer line that comes from the firewall over to a distribution block. There's a couple little T's that are held on with clamps onto a couple of those bolts in the oil sump. We'll get those off there too. That may be easier to do once I get it pulled away from the firewall. And the ones around the back will be easier anyway. And I should replace all those primer lines anyway. They're copper lines. They've been on there for 2,000 hours, so copper gets work hardened and will eventually crack. Although I haven't had any trouble with these. A lot of times I'll have those primer lines crack where they go into the cylinder heads, and I'll have to trim those off and put them back on again, reattach them. But these lines haven't been too bad on this overhaul. So, but it's just 1/8 inch copper line, so it's not a big deal, and they're compression fittings. Yeah, compressions fittings on there. So they're easy enough to do. I got everything disconnected from the bottom. To work on that stuff under there, it's easier to stand on the floor than on my work platform. So I put my work platform out of the way, leaned it up against the forward door. Got a couple more things to do on it now, and that's on the top of the engine, so I put the work platform back on there. The only thing left to do that connects the engine to the airframe is to disconnect the P-leads off from the magnetos, and I kind of waited to do that till last because once they're disconnected then the magnetos are hot. But since I've got the spark plug wires disconnected from the spark plugs, that's really not such a big deal. And then I've got a couple of ground wires. There's one that on this side that goes from the engine, is bolted onto the engine mount that makes a positive ground between the engine case itself, the engine itself, the engine mount, and supposedly through the engine mount into the airframe. But then to make sure I got a positive ground into the airframe itself or into the airplane itself, I've made a ground wire that went from the other side, from the crankcase over to the firewall. Otherwise, she's almost free of attachments there. Here's the P-leads, you call them, for the magneto. This one's for the left magneto. That's disconnected from that. And this is the ground wire that I made up to ground, make a positive ground between the engine case and the airframe. And this is the ground cable. This goes here to the engine case, to a bolt here, and into the engine mount, and those are disconnected. So that's the last of everything that is attaching the engine to the airframe, except for these bolts right here for the engine mount bolts themselves. So the next thing to do is to take the propeller spinner off and the propeller off, to pull the ring gear off, the starter ring gear off, so that I can get the alternator belt off. The ring gear stays with the engine. It goes back on the engine and gets shipped with the engine. And once those are off, I'll set the engine hoist up, or the chain hoist up someplace there where it's over the center of that engine, and take just a little bit of the weight off of it, and then I can pull those mounting bolts off there, and that engine will come right off.